So, I just watched the Netflix original Death Note movie. Let's talk about it. I honestly didn't plan on doing this review. This is entirely spontaneous and is going to seem very unscripted because I'm working on very loose notes with this one. I didn't even intend to watch this movie. I just got so intrigued by everything else that everybody was saying about it that I couldn't help myself. I'm not like an uber fan of Death Note or anything. I only watched the anime once several years ago, rewatching a few episodes here and there since then, of the dub mostly. But I have a lot of respect for it. It was the smartest anime of its era, and I would argue is still one of the smartest anime to have ever aired. The story of Death Note is incredibly complex, but put as simply as possible, a Shinigami, a Japanese death god, named Ryuk, drops his death note to Earth in the hopes that someone will find it and entertain him with it. In it can be written the name of any person, and that person will die. There are all kinds of rules to using the death note. Things like if you write specifics into the way that the person died, they will die in that specific way within limits. But really the only rule that matters is that you have to be able to picture the person and you have to know their real name. You have to write their real name into the book. The death note is found by a character named Light Yagami, a bored schoolboy in Japan. He's this uber genius who doesn't find thrill in anything, and suddenly he finds this book. And he decides to use it to kill bad people and make the world a better place. But now he's a killer, and so he has all these dramatic things happening all around him. The story is primarily about him becoming more and more desperate to survive this ordeal for as long as possible and accomplish his goals. He's opposed by a brilliant detective known only as L, one of my all-time favorite anime characters. The relationship between him and Light is just, it's one of the best things about the show. It may be the best thing about the show. And over time, Light just devolves into the quintessential villain protagonist. Because he is the protagonist of the story, but by the end, he's the bad guy. Like, arguably, from the start, he's the bad guy, but by the end, there's really no questioning it anymore. And that is literally the most that I can tell you about it. I can't tell you anything else. I've probably already spoiled a couple of things that I shouldn't have. Because at the end of the day, Death Note is a story of intrigue. It has to be experienced. It's an edge-of-your-seat kind of show. It's constantly flipping the script on you and piling drama on top of drama, keeping you guessing. It never lets you rest. And it manages this with very little action. Most of it is just dialogue and behaviors and internal monologues of all things. Hearing what the character of Light is thinking in a specific situation. Experiencing along with him what it's like to work through these problems as they come. When I heard that they were trying to adapt this into a live-action movie for Netflix, I was really concerned. Netflix has some niche programming that isn't meant for a very broad demographic, but this certainly wasn't being marketed as that. This was just another Netflix original movie. It wasn't really being geared towards anime fans, or fans of the original even, all that much. Anime is a notoriously difficult genre to adapt for American audiences, because American audiences don't consume anime the way that Japanese audiences do. In Japan, anime is consumed by various demographics, and there are animes written to target those demographics. It's just another medium for telling the same kinds of TV stories that we would get here, just geared towards the Japanese culture. And there are, of course, things that anime does that we don't really have an analog for here, but you get the point. But here, because we don't consume that kind of media in an animated form, in an artistic form, such as anime, there isn't as broad an audience here in America. Add to that the fact that anime has a lot of Japanese cultural references built right into it, and it's obvious why it's so difficult to adapt. Even dubbing anime is difficult. Just look at Yu-Gi-Oh! Or even better, One Piece. The dubs of those are notoriously atrocious. It didn't help that they came over here at a time when cartoons were still a thing for kids, and so they were dubbed over to be kids shows when they're not. And granted, Death Note started to come over to America later than that, so that problem didn't exist in quite the same way that it had back when things like Yu-Gi-Oh! And One Piece were being brought over here. But Death Note, just by its nature, is even more difficult to make relatable to American audiences, because it's not like One Piece, for example. It's not a show where the story is basically just a reason to get to the fights. One Piece is a shonen anime. It's a fighting anime. Yes, it has strong characters, and yes, it has good stories, but for the most part, the appeal of it is the fights, the fight set pieces, the action. In a very similar way to how people can appreciate a summer blockbuster just as a summer blockbuster, people can appreciate something like One Piece, or Yu-Gi-Oh!, or Dragon Ball, or Yu Yu Hakusho as only an action piece, ignoring everything else. That doesn't translate over as well in the case of a story like Death Note. It's a very dark story. People don't take to that as readily. And I'm not saying that when Death Note came over to America it had the same problem as something like One Piece did. No one tried to turn this into a kids show, and the dub is actually really good. What I'm saying is that this movie is a similar sort of adaptation attempt to one of those old 90s anime dubs. This movie was meant to appeal to a broader demographic, and so it was written and structured and built upon that premise. First of all, the narrative was moved to America. Light Yagami became Light Turner, which at its core makes sense. But the way that they handled this character, it didn't work. And I want to be clear about something. I want to address the whitewashing issue that a lot of people have had with this movie, claiming that making the lead character white when he was originally Asian is whitewashing, and I guess by the strictest definition it is. But while there are certainly Asian Americans, it does in a way make sense for this version of Light to be a white kid, based on the setting and the demographic that this version of Light was supposed to be a part of. It made sense for them to make him white, just like it made sense for them to make Elle a black kid. The way I see it when you're casting something, while diversity is great, I'm all for it, you guys know that. Unless the character's heritage is integral to the plot or their development, the part should go to whoever is best suited for this iteration of the character. And for the story they were trying to tell, I think this was the right kid to play this character. That doesn't mean I think they went in a good direction with it, or that I liked this version of the character. I just think that for what they were trying to do here, it made sense. Like I said, the obvious goal of this movie was to try to broaden the demographic appeal of Death Note, and I do think that this was an acceptable way of going about it. But this version of Light, he does all the same things that the anime version, and I'm sure the manga version of Light as well, did. And I still believe that he would do them and that he would be capable of doing them, but I just didn't believe him as the same character. His motivation is slightly different. First of all, he's doing this in part to impress a girl, which Light in the anime never would have given two craps about. Light in the anime was a thrill seeker who excused his behavior by claiming that he was trying to do good. And there's a little bit of that in this version of Light. You pick up on that a little bit, but his motivations still come off as being completely different for the most part. And so this version of Light ends up coming off as almost an entirely different character who just happens to do the same things. He's not awful or anything, it's just he doesn't work in this story because he's so different. I mentioned the relationship between Light and Elle is such a big part of the story, and that just didn't feel right here. What we got of that just didn't feel right here because this Light was so different. Though I didn't have a problem with their version of Elle at all, so I know they can get this right. I don't think they did in this case. Now maybe there are people out there who are bigger Death Note fans than me who actually liked this take on the character. I don't know, it's just I didn't like him. For the most part, the things that he did were just as compelling, but let me put it this way. One of the biggest appeals of Light's character in the anime, and this is going to spoil a little bit more, I apologize. One of the biggest appeals of his character is that you're so compelled to see what he's going to do next that even though you know that what he's doing is wrong, even though a part of you wants to see him fail to overcome the attempts to stop him, there is an equally large part of you who is constantly rooting for him to succeed. The Netflix version of Light, I was still compelled to see what he did next. There was still a part of me that wanted to see him fail at it. But there just wasn't that part of me that wanted to see him succeed. That part of me didn't exist this time, and that took a huge chunk away from the character. There's also the issue that Ryuk, who was a big part of the anime, was barely in this. He was cool when he was on screen, and I'll let anyone who decides to watch the movie experience that for themselves. But there just wasn't enough of him to really matter. His presence didn't really end up elevating the story because he barely had a presence. I don't want to get much more into this because if you are someone who likes compelling drama or who likes great anime or any combination of the two, I definitely think you should watch Death Note or read the manga. So for the sake of people out there who haven't done either yet, I'm not gonna talk about the story anymore. Except I will say, oh, I almost forgot about this. Because this fits perfectly into the whole thing about broadening demographic appeal. Those of you who have watched this movie or who intend to watch this movie will know exactly what I'm talking about when I say unnecessary chase scene. They tried to American this movie up by adding an unnecessary chase scene, adding an action scene into a drama. But here's the thing. As much as I think the original Death Note is a masterpiece, even if it does kind of go off the rails at the end and Light makes some choices that I feel are really out of character for him, as much as I think it's a masterpiece, if you're someone who doesn't like anime or manga, but are intrigued by the premise of this story, then I'd say you should watch the movie. You'll probably really like it. It's not terrible, and it manages to do most of what Death Note is good at doing. Though I will recommend that you keep in mind that this isn't the entire story of Death Note in this movie. There's more to it, and from what I understand, they had planned to make more movies, so maybe that'll still happen. Point being, if you aren't an anime fan and you find this story intriguing, watch the movie. You'll probably like it, as I said. But if you do like anime or manga, there is no reason to watch this movie. The anime is so much better. So if you like anime, or you can even just tolerate anime, and this sounds intriguing to you, you should go watch the anime, assuming that you haven't already. And I think that's what infuriates me the most about this. Yeah, this was an attempt to bring this really great, really intriguing story to more people, but they did it in such a misguided way that I came out of this entire situation feeling like this wasn't at all necessary. Because I rate things primarily based on how well they managed to represent what it is that they're trying to be. And because this is technically part of the Death Note franchise, and so I must compare it to the original. I rate this movie with a 4.5 out of 10. It might be closer to a 6.5, maybe a 7, if the original didn't exist. But it does. And the funny thing is, I'm still being a lot nicer to this movie than a lot of people. Go watch some other reviews by some other critics and you'll see exactly what I mean. It's really, it's pretty sad. All of that said though, guys, if you have seen the Netflix version of Death Note, what did you think of it? Let's get a discussion going in the comment section down below. Thank you very much for putting up with this very random, very stream of consciousness-y review. This has been AJ22, and I will talk to you guys later.